Friends who are online, I invite you to continue sharing as you will. And I'll Shay to put a few more stones into the bowl to symbolize all those joys and sorrows not shared out loud but held in our hearts. Kumbaya, my Lord, kumbaya. Kumbaya, my Lord, kumbaya. Kumbaya, my Lord, kumbaya. Oh Lord, kumbaya. Can we hold some silence with that melody in our minds in honor of those young lives taken, in honor of those lives well lived, in honor of those lives in pain, for all those who are crying? For all those things that are needed to come by here to heal and to help, may it be so. Amen. We are all bound up together. A freeborn native of Baltimore, Maryland, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper gave her first anti-slavery lecture in New Bedford, Massachusetts in 1854. Her books of poetry enhanced her prominence, but when she, in 1859, wrote an open letter to the condemned John Brown, her correspondence was read by tens of thousands of Americans. In May 1866, Harper addressed the 11th National Women's Rights Convention in New York City, where she sat on the platform with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Please help me welcome Frances Ellen Watkins Harper.
I feel I am something of a novice upon this platform, born of a race whose inheritance has been outrage and wrong. Most of my life had been spent in battling against those wrongs. But I did not feel as keenly as others that I had these rights in common with other women, which are now demanded. About 2 years ago, I stood within the shadows of my home. A great sorrow had fallen upon my life. My husband had died suddenly, leaving me a widow with 4 children, one of my own, and the others stepchildren. I tried to keep my children together. But my husband died in debt, and before he had been in the grave 3 months, the administrator had swept the very milk crocks and wash tubs from my hand. I was a farmer's wife and made butter for the Columbus market. But what could I do when they had swept it all away? They left me one thing, and that was a looking glass. Had I died instead of my husband, how different would have been the result? By this time, he would have had another wife, it is likely, and no administrator would have gone into his house, broken up his home, and sold his bed, and taken away his means of support. I took my children in my arms and went out to seek my living. While I was gone, a neighbor whom I had lent $5 went before a magistrate and swore that he believed I was a non-resident and laid an attachment upon my very bed. And I went back to Ohio with my orphan children in my arms, without a single feather bed in this wide world that was not in custody of the law. I say then that justice is not fulfilled so long as woman is unequal before the law. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. You tried that in the case of the Negro. You pressed him down for 2 centuries, and in so doing, you crippled the moral strength and paralyzed the spiritual energies of the white men of the country. When the hands of the black were fettered, white men were deprived of the liberty of speech and the freedom of the press. Society cannot afford to neglect the enlightenment of any class of its members. At the South, the legislation of the country was in behalf of the rich slaveholders, which the poor white man was neglected. What is the consequence today? From that very class of neglected poor white men comes the man who stands today with his hand on the helm of the nation. He fails to catch the watchword of the hour and throws himself, the incarnation of meanness, across the pathway of the nation. My objection to Andrew Johnson is not that he has been a poor white man. My objection is that he keeps poor wits all the way through. That is the trouble with him. This grand and glorious revolution which has commenced will fail to reach its climax of success until throughout the length and breadth of the American Republic, the nation shall be so colorblind as to know no man by the color of his skin or the curl of his hair. It will then have no privileged class, trampling upon and outraging the underprivileged classes, but will then be one great privileged nation whose privilege will be to produce the loftiest manhood and womanhood that humanity can attain. I do not believe that giving the woman the ballot is immediately going to cure the ills of life. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. I think that, like men, they may be divided into 3 classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent. The good would vote according to their convictions and principles, the bad as dictated by prejudice or malice, and the indifferent will vote on the strongest side of the question with the winning party. You white women here speak of rights. I speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which has made me feel as if I were in the situation of Ishmael. Whew. My hand against every man, and every man's hand against me. Let me go tomorrow morning and take my seat on one of your streetcars. I do not know that they will do it in New York, but they will in Philadelphia, and the conductor will put up his hand and stop the car rather than let me ride. Going from Washington to Baltimore this spring, they put me in the smoking car. In the capital of the nation, where the black man consecrated himself to the nation's defense, faithful when the white man was faithless, they put me in the smoking car. They did it once, but the next time they tried it, they failed, for I would not go in. I felt the fight in me, but I don't want to fight all the time. Today I am puzzled where to make my home. I would like to make it in Philadelphia, near my own friends and relations, But if I want to ride in the streets of Philadelphia, they send me to ride on the platform with the driver. Have women nothing to do with this? Not long since, a colored woman took her seat in an 11th Street car in Philadelphia, and the conductor stopped the car and told the rest of the passengers to get out, and left the car with her in it alone when they took it back to the station. One day I took my seat in the car, and the conductor came to me and told me to take another seat. I just screamed, "Murder!" The man said that if I was black, I ought to behave myself. I knew that if he was white, he was not behaving himself. Are there not wrongs to be righted? In advocating for the cause of the colored man since the Dred Scott decision, I have sometimes said I thought the nation had touched bottom. But let me tell you, there is a depth of infamy lower than that. It is when the nation, standing upon the threshold of a great peril, reached out its hands to a feebler race and asked that race to help it. And when the peril was over, said, "You are good enough for soldiers, but not good enough for citizens." We have a woman in our country who has received that name of Moses, not by lying about it, but by acting it out. A woman who has gone into the Egypt of slavery and brought out hundreds of our people into liberty. The last time I saw that woman, her hands were swollen. That woman who had led one of Montgomery's most successful expeditions, who was brave enough to act as a scout for the American Army, had her hands all swollen from a conflict with a brutal conductor who undertook to eject her from her place. That woman, whose courage and bravery won a recognition from our Army and from every black man in the land, is excluded from every thoroughfare of travel. Talk of giving women the ballot box? Go on. It is a normal school, and the white women of this country need it. While there exists this brutal element in society which tramples upon the feeble and treads down the weak, I tell you that if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothings and selfishness, it is the white women of America.
I had the privilege of visiting Frances Ellen Watkins Harper at her final resting place in Eden Cemetery, just outside of Philadelphia, with a group of folks here. And to learn more about that story, I invite Tim Steyer to share a little bit of our history and connection to one of our great heroes.
I just wanted to recount my first introduction. You got it. My first introduction to Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, whom I had never heard of before, but it was in 1992, and it was in March of 1992, and I don't know, and I haven't, maybe Harold, do you remember the date of the commemoration that we had in March 1992 for Frances Ellen Watkins Harper at First U? I asked Harold because he was here then, and I did reach out to Stephanie Garrett, who now lives in Cape May. She hasn't responded. I have written on here March 25th, 1992, but it turns out that was a Wednesday, and I remember clearly this was on a Saturday night, but it was a commemoration that was jointly held by this congregation First Unitarian in Center City, and Unitarian Society of Germantown, and also Mother Bethel. What I clearly remember is how I got there. So Darlene and I, we were anxious as to how we were going to get there. Marion Napper, she was not the moderator. It was Maggie Heineman was the moderator at that time. Marion says, "Stay at your front door. The big limousine's going to come up and get you and pick you and Darlene up." And I'm wondering, the big limousine, and here it was, Brad and Julie pulled up. Brad had this big Cadillac, and we went together that night. Let me read to you what Bill Dykeman recounted in, and it's online also, the 175-year anniversary of our congregation about that night, and I remember it very clearly. In describing the event, Bob Throne said there were 500 people from all over the Delaware Valley, several dozen city dignitaries and descendants of the honoree, that was Francis Ellen Watkins Harper, in attendance, a wonderful, diverse crowd. The hymns sounded warm and full. The choir from Mother Bethel AME sang, and our choir was to sing. But Jane Halting's father had died, and she couldn't be there, so Howard Holtzman, some of you may remember Howard Holtzman, who was the son of Bob and Doris Holtzman, who had filled in at some rehearsal, stepped forward, and Restoration's voices brought to the moment the joy and energy and spirit that the event deserved. The experience itself was memorable, but knowing the circumstances and knowing the hearts of our singers was overwhelming. I clearly remember the outstanding performance by our choir at that time. And it was a memorable experience, and I remember it brought the crowd to its feet. You should also know that Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was a member of First Unitarian Church, although she mostly went to church at Mother Bethel. Her funeral was in 1911, was held at First Unitarian. Let me just read to you, this is one of the highlights of my membership here. And some of the folks that some of you may recall, some may not, who were there. Augusta Clark, who was head of city council, was the honorary chair. Dr. Maya Angelou, right? Dr. Malefi Keti Asante, the Honorable Louise William Bishop, who was a state senator up until a couple years ago. Councilwoman Janie Blackwell, Charles Bloxon, right? These are all the folks that were with us that night. State Representative Andy Karn, who this is State Councilman at Large David Cohen, who I knew very well. He was also a councilwoman, a council person here. That's he says here, Councilman at Large. Senator Chaka Fattah, who was one of my contemporaries from way back when, and a descendant of hers. That's right. And his mother was there, Sister Falaka Fattah. Councilwoman Happy Fernandez, some of you may remember her. Jim Kenney, Councilman James Kenney, right? Claude Lewis, who used to write for the Enquirer. Thatcher Longstreth. Councilman Michael A. Nutter. Councilman Angel Ortiz. And some of you may remember that he was a very good friend of mine and a mentor, State Representative Dave Richardson, right? Sonia Sanchez, State Senator Allison Schwartz, Councilwoman Joan Spector, right? Chuck Stone, who used to come here, by the way, quite often. Council President John Street, the Honorable Anna Verna, The local steering committee was First Unitarian Church, Billy Penn Johnson, Robin Larson, and the Reverend Benjamin Mossier. Unitarian Society of Germantown, Fran Emery. Anybody remember Fran Emery? Right? And the Reverend Nina Gray. Unitarian Universalist Church of the Restoration, Patricia Ashara DeBrady. Who knows Pat DeBrady, right? And the Reverend Bob Throne, who was the chair. And Mother Bethel was Catherine B. Dawkins, Ruby S. Rowe, and the Reverend Richard Norris. I'm going to pass this around. I know there's another copy somewhere so you all could take a look at it. Just be careful with it. It's one of my many artifacts from being a member, long-term member here. But for some reason, I have Francis Ellen Watkins Harper book, A Brighter Coming Day. It's prominent on my bookshelf, and this stays out. So I can always handily get this. So this is what this means to me and to our congregation. Thank you.
This is September 26th through 28th, 1992. I'm looking up.
Okay, thank you.
These words are from Bob Throne, dearly departed. At the Saturday evening service at First Philadelphia, all four choirs sang. There were 600 people in attendance. Another highlight was Pat DeBrady in period costume reciting words of Harper's. And he spoke about the origin of this, of he and Pat going out to Eden Cemetery to find her headstone. And the original one had fallen over, was literally covered with mud and grass. And after spending a few minutes to maybe an hour searching, getting ready to leave, and Pat kicked something on their way and bent down, and that was the headstone. And our African-American colleagues in the Unitarian Universalist Association and from the AME with Mother Bethel raised funds for a new headstone that was put in. So these are stories that we hear now. Some of us know, some of us have forgotten, and have been told in different ways. Let's take a moment to sit with what we've heard. I'm going to invite Lynn to play our middle hymn, I Know I Can. I'm going to invite you to sit. And if you would like to sing, we can sing quietly. If you would like to hum, you can hum loudly. Let's enter into a space of meditation to sing, I Know I Can. Thank you, Lynn.
Our reading today is from the multimedia public history project, Ballot and Beyond. It is transcribed from the episode Abolitionist to Suffragist, Frederick Douglass, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, read by Shante William Daniels, Executive Director of the Baltimore National Heritage Area. Women played an active role in advocating for an end to slavery, but faced gender discrimination from their abolitionist peers, as well as the general public, who felt that women were taking too vocal a public role. Many white abolitionist women began to draw comparisons between the nation's treatment of enslaved persons and the legal discrimination against women. Frustrated by sexist treatment by fellow abolitionists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott convened the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in New York in July 1848. The convention drew 300 men and women who collaborated to produce a Declaration of Sentiments that was modeled on the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration proclaimed the equal rights of women and men and detailed the many abuses facing American women. A key figure in the drafting of the Declaration was nationally known abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who had been born into slavery on Maryland's eastern shore. Douglass was a critical ally for Elizabeth Cady Stanton in her bold decision to propose a resolution calling for women's enfranchisement. Frederick Douglass was the lone man in attendance who supported the resolution. This important moment marked the beginning of a fragile, racially mixed coalition of men and women who sought expanded rights for all people, including the right to vote. In 1866, Douglass, Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony formed the American Equal Rights Association, or AERA, to secure equal rights to all American citizens, especially the right of suffrage, irrespective of race, color, or sex. This more inclusive organization had the support of African American activists like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a published poet and author who had been born free in Baltimore in 1825 and campaigned around the country for temperance, abolition, and women's rights. In an attempt to create social unity after the American Civil War, AERA members, like Harper, believed it was the right time to integrate gender, race, and class-based advocacy in a broad push for equality. With the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870 that granted the right to vote to black men but not to women, an integrated and holistic approach for equality would never coalesce. In fact, many suffragists opposed the 15th Amendment, refusing to accept that black men would have the right to vote before white women. The unification that Douglass and Harper sought would not happen, and racial tensions would echo throughout the remainder of the women's suffragette movement and often dictated a separate course of action for white and black suffragists. As a segregated movement proceeded, Watkins Harper would help found the American Women's Suffrage Association and served as vice president of the National Association of Colored Women, among many other civic and literary achievements. Watkins Harper died 9 years before the passage of the 19th Amendment.
Someone's crying, Lord, kumbaya. Someone's crying, Lord, kumbaya. Someone's crying, Lord, kumbaya. Oh, Lord, kumbaya. I'm actually quite happy with how most of this turned out, I gotta be honest. Some of us are not blessed with the curly hair of which so often people have been judged throughout our history, but we make do with what we have. The limits of tyrants. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are people who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Words of Frederick Douglass. In my UU history class, we were offered the chance to look up and research UU saints. Mine is James Freeman Clark, but he's not about this story. This story is about Francis and Frederick, one born free and one born into slavery, both of whom used their words and their education to agitate, to call for change, to make a difference. Many of us are familiar with Frederick Douglass's name, and if you were like Tim and I, you might not have known much about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Maybe before today. That's all right. A name covered over in history, to be found again, perhaps by the stubbing of a toe, perhaps by your decision to be here today. It does not matter how or why you hear her name first, but it does matter that we hear her name, that we speak her name, and that we look up to the great example that both she and Frederick Douglass set by using their bravery and their values and their smarts and their words to do whatever they could to push for change. I'm sure they had many disagreements. I'm sure they were colleagues on many occasions, and I can only imagine the kind of verbal semantics and fireworks that must have gotten when they were together. But in their work across the aisle to make things not just better for black men or for women, for black women, but for everyone, they were committed to a vision of democracy and representative republic and equality and justice for all. That, as we've heard, not everyone who was part of the suffragist movement, not everyone who was part of the racial justice movement, not everyone who was part of the civil rights movement always had in mind. All means all. As we say where I'm from, y'all means all. And whether you are a person born into enslavement on the shores of Maryland who goes on to find freedom and become one of the most celebrated orators and the most photographed man in the 19th century, or a woman born free who used her education and power to write words that inspired generations, to find those words lost to some of history, to some of us, to be found again more recently and lifted up. Whether you're a small, non-binary teenager in Oklahoma, all means all. This month is a celebration of black excellence and lifting up black history that inspires us, including people who look like me, who were taught that our history may not include people like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. When given the list of UU saints, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was not a choice. It wasn't one I didn't know I could make. And that's not because the folks teaching that class were intentionally ignorant or trying to set up a system that was incomplete. Sometimes we don't always know origin stories. We don't always know where Kumbaya came from. What we now know is that the importance of someone whose words about being bound together, perhaps in a mutual garment of destiny, The words of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper inspired many, many people. She was a household name in the 19th century, our historians tell us. And those words inspired people like Dr. King, the civil rights movement, who would take these words on being bound together, that my interdependence and my liberation is bound up in yours, that all of us need all of us to make it, that it is not just about getting something for this group or this group, that when people like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper agitate for their rights, everyone gets the benefit. Everyone. When the words, "Come by here, my Lord, come by here," someone's crying, someone's hurting, someone is in need. Those words are not just about other people. They are about all of us. And if one of us is crying, if one of us is homeless, if one of us is hurt or killed for who they are, all of us suffer. All of us suffer. And not one of us has what we need until all of us have what we need and what we deserve. That was the vision of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And it was the vision of Frederick Douglass when he said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." And it can be uncomfortable to make those demands. And for some of us, that is putting on a stole and going out into the streets. For some of us, that is taking time to clean the gravestone of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. For some of us, that is supporting the food pantry here, doing the small works of justice and equity. To make a demand. To make a demand. There are many ways to be inspired by the legacy of people like Frances Ellen. And part of the call of Black History Month is not only to lift up these stories of Black excellence and to learn from them, but to be inspired by them, to demand change where you are, with what you have, with your words, with your education, with your body, with your cooking, with your music, whatever it is. You are invited to be part of that thing that comes by here to heal suffering, to find what was lost. For Frances Ellen and the many women and men whose stories we have lost, but whose words and actions continue to inspire us. For the gems of Philadelphia history, of UU history, of our history. For our UU saints. And for someone for whom we did not often talk about as a founding figure of this country, but for a country that did not start out as a democracy for all and continues to not be a democracy for all. She and Frederick Douglass ought to be listed as founding mothers and fathers and parents of this country. I'm so grateful to have learned more about her, to have stubbed my toe and found out of this great life, to have been able to visit her with a group from this congregation. And I'm so looking forward to telling her story to my children, to make it part of their story. We will end with the words of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper that Shay is going to read.
This is entitled Songs for the People. Let me make the songs for the people, songs for the old and young, songs to stir like a battle cry wherever they are sung. Not for the clashing of sabers, for carnage nor for strife, but songs to thrill the hearts of men with more abundant life. Let me make the songs for the weary amid life's fever and fret, till hearts shall relax their tension and careworn brows forget. Let me sing for little children before their footsteps stray, sweet anthems of love and duty to float o'er life's highway. I would sing for the poor and aged when shadows dim their sight, of the bright and restful mansions where there shall be no night. Our world, so worn and weary, needs music pure and strong to hush the jangle and discords of sorrow, pain, and wrong. Music to soothe all its sorrow till war and crime shall cease, and the hearts of men grown tender girdle the world in peace.
Kumbaya, my Lord, kumbaya.
Kumbaya, my Lord, kumbaya. Kumbaya, my Lord, kumbaya. Oh Lord, kumbaya.
May it be so. Amen.
Amen. Now is the time when we take up our offering of financial resources for the good of this community. Ushers, please go ahead and start the passing of the plates here in the sanctuary. We know there are many ways to give back to this congregation, and we encourage you to find a way that works for you. For giving of financial support, your money or checks put in the plate will be used to fund the ministries of this